The pre-dawn darkness hung heavy over John F. Kennedy International Airport on that Monday morning in December 1978, inside the Lufthansa cargo terminal. Security guard Kerry Weiland was counting down the minutes until his shift ended. It was 3:12 a.m. when he heard the side door open, before he could turn around. He felt the cold press of a gun barrel against his neck. A calm voice whispered, "Don't move, don't make a sound, do exactly what we say, and you'll go home to your family." What happened over the next 63 minutes would become the stuff of legend. $6 million in cash, $875,000 in jewelry. The biggest cash robbery in American history at that time. A crime so perfectly planned, so meticulously executed, that it should have been the ultimate heist. The kind of score that sets a criminal up for life and becomes a whispered legend in the underworld. But perfection in crime is a myth, and this perfect crime would become a perfect nightmare. The mastermind behind it all was a man named James Burke. Though everyone called him Jimmy the Gent, by the time the dust settled, more than a dozen people would be dead, murdered on Jimmy's orders to protect the secret. The money would vanish like morning mist, and the man who orchestrated the greatest robbery in American history would die alone in a prison cell, never even charged with the crime that defined his legacy. This is his story, the complete, unvarnished truth about a man born into abandonment, raised by violence, and consumed by the very paranoia that made him successful. It's a story about the American dream, twisted into something dark and terrible. It's about loyalty and betrayal, genius and madness, wealth and death. Before we dive into the incredible true story of Jimmy the Gent Burke, let me ask you something. Where in the world are you right now? What time is it where you are? Drop your location and time in the comments below. If you're settling in for this epic tale, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with anyone who loves true crime stories. Because what you're about to hear is the kind of story that stays with you long after it's over. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to a sweltering July day in 1931, when a baby was born who should never have survived his first day of life. James Burke entered the world on July 5, 1931, in New York City at the height of the Great Depression. His mother was a young woman who found herself pregnant and alone, abandoned by the child's father, desperate in a city that showed no mercy to the desperate. The exact details of what happened next vary, depending on who tells the story. But the core truth remains horrifying. In an act of desperation or madness or both, she left her newborn infant in a coal furnace. The baby was discovered by workers before the furnace was lit. It was a miracle, the kind that should have been a sign of a life blessed by fortune. Instead, it was the first chapter in a life that would be defined by abandonment, violence, and ultimately, a cold-blooded ruthlessness that would shock even hardened criminals. The infant was placed in the care of New York City's foster system, a bureaucratic machine that in 1931 was overwhelmed and underfunded. The boy who would become Jimmy Burke was shuffled from one foster home to another throughout his childhood. Some homes were merely neglectful. Others were actively abusive. In the foster care system of Depression-era New York, children were often treated as unpaid labor, mouths to feed in exchange for work, with little concern for their emotional or psychological well-being. Young James Burke learned early that the world was not a kind place. He learned that trust was dangerous, that adults would fail you, that the only person you could count on was yourself. These lessons, learned in childhood, would shape everything that came after. They would create the contradictions that defined him, a man who could be unfailingly polite and generous to those in his circle, while being utterly merciless to anyone who crossed him. By the time he was 12 years old, Jimmy Burke was already running with street gangs in Queens. He was smart, exceptionally so, with a natural gift for organization and planning. While other kids were getting caught shoplifting candy, young Jimmy was thinking bigger. He organized other boys to create distractions while he stole items that could actually be sold for real money. He wasn't interested in petty theft for the thrill. He was interested in theft as a business. His first arrest came at age 13. For burglary, it wouldn't be his last. Throughout his teenage years, Jimmy was in and out of reform schools and youth detention centers. But unlike many young criminals who simply served their time and learned nothing, Jimmy used every incarceration as an opportunity. He learned from older criminals. He studied their methods. Their mistakes, their successes, he read voraciously. Everything from crime novels to books on psychology and business management, he understood instinctively that crime, done properly, was a business like any other. What set Jimmy apart was his self-control. Many young criminals were impulsive, driven by emotion, quick to violence. Jimmy learned to be patient. He learned to plan. He learned that the criminals who lasted, who didn't end up dead or in prison by age 25, were the ones who thought 3 steps ahead. He learned to wear a mask of respectability, to dress well, to speak politely, to never let anyone see the calculation happening behind his eyes. By his late teens, Jimmy Burke had earned a nickname that would follow him throughout his life. The Gent. He dressed in expensive suits. Even when he could barely afford them, he was polite to strangers, especially to women and the elderly. He tipped well. He spoke quietly, never raised his voice, never made threats he didn't intend to follow through on. People who met him casually would never suspect they were talking to a man who could order a murder as casually as ordering a sandwich. In the early 1950s, Jimmy Burke came to the attention of the Lucchese crime family, one of New York's 5 families. Specifically, he caught the eye of Paul Vario, a capo in the Lucchese family who ran operations in Brooklyn and Queens. Vario was a tough, old-school mobster who valued intelligence and loyalty above all else. In Jimmy Burke, he saw potential. There was one complication. Jimmy Burke was Irish, not Italian in the traditional mafia structure. You couldn't be a made man, a full member of the family, unless you had Italian blood. This barrier would define much of Jimmy's criminal career. No matter how successful he became, no matter how much money he made for the family, he would always be an outsider, an associate, never a full member. Some men would have been bitter about this limitation. Jimmy Burke was pragmatic. He understood the rules of the game and played within them. He became invaluable to Paul Vario and the Lucchese family, handling jobs that required planning and discretion. He proved himself again and again, and in return, Vario gave him protection and a share of the profits. Under Vario's mentorship, Jimmy learned the business of organized crime. He learned about hijacking trucks, how to fence stolen goods, how to run protection rackets, how to loan money at usurious rates and enforce collection. He learned the politics of the underworld. Who could be trusted, who needed to be watched, who needed to be eliminated. More importantly, he learned about violence, not the hot-blooded violence of street thugs, but the cold, calculated violence of professional criminals. He learned that violence was a tool to be used sparingly and strategically. He learned that the threat of violence was often more effective than violence itself. And he learned that when violence was necessary, it needed to be thorough, leaving no witnesses, no loose ends. Throughout the 1950s, Jimmy Burke built his reputation robbery by robbery. He specialized in hijacking trucks loaded with valuable goods, cigarettes, alcohol, electronics, clothing. The method was almost always the same: extensive surveillance to learn the route and timing, a careful selection of the location for the hijacking, overwhelming force applied quickly to minimize resistance, and a well-planned disposal of the goods through fences who could move the merchandise quickly. Jimmy's hijackings were legendary for their precision. He would spend weeks preparing for a single job, learning every detail, planning for every contingency. When his crew moved, they moved like a military operation. Drivers were rarely hurt. Jimmy understood that violence created problems. Injured drivers meant police pressure, which meant heat on the entire operation. Better to scare them, take the goods, and let them go unharmed. By the end of the 1950s, Jimmy Burke was married to a woman named Mickey, and they were starting a family. To the outside world, he was a successful businessman, owner of a bar in Queens, living the American dream. Only a select few knew the truth, that Jimmy Burke was one of the most successful and feared criminals in New York City. A man who had pulled off dozens of major robberies without ever serving serious prison time. But the 1960s would bring new opportunities and new challenges. Jimmy was about to build an empire, recruit a crew that would become infamous in criminal history, and set in motion the events that would lead to the Lufthansa heist and the bloodbath that followed. In 1963, Jimmy Burke purchased a bar in South Ozone Park, Queens, a working-class neighborhood where cops didn't ask too many questions and neighbors minded their own business. He named it Robert's Lounge, after his son. On the surface, it was a neighborhood bar. Nothing special, dark wood paneling, a long bar with vinyl-covered stools, some booths in the back, a jukebox playing the hits of the day. But Robert's Lounge was much more than a bar. It was Jimmy Burke's headquarters, his office, his meeting place. In the back rooms, away from casual customers, criminal business was conducted. Hijackings were planned, stolen goods were distributed, money was counted, debts were collected. It was from Robert's Lounge that Jimmy built his criminal empire. The beauty of Robert's Lounge was its duality. Legitimate customers came in for a drink after work, watched the game, went home. They had no idea that at the table in the corner, men were planning the robbery of a jewelry shipment worth $500,000. The bar provided cover, legitimacy, and a steady flow of cash that could be used to launder the proceeds from criminal activities. Jimmy ran Robert's Lounge the same way he ran his criminal operations, with careful attention to detail. The books were kept meticulously, at least the legitimate books. The place was clean, well-maintained. Jimmy was there most evenings, buying rounds for regulars, chatting with customers, playing the role of genial host. All the while, his mind was working, planning the next job, evaluating his crew, watching for any signs of disloyalty or weakness. A criminal organization is only as strong as the men who comprise it. And Jimmy Burke was a genius at recruiting and managing talent. He had an eye for spotting useful skills, for identifying men who had the stomach for serious crime, but also the discipline to follow orders and keep their mouths shut. In 1960, a young man named Henry Hill started hanging around Robert's Lounge. Hill was half Irish, half Sicilian, a kid from the neighborhood who idolized gangsters and wanted desperately to be part of that world. He was just a teenager, but Jimmy saw potential. Hill was smart, eager, and willing to work. Jimmy took him under his wing, much as Paul Vario had done for Jimmy years earlier. Henry Hill became Jimmy's protégé. Jimmy taught him the business, brought him along on jobs, showed him how to think like a professional criminal rather than a street punk. Hill proved himself capable and loyal, and as the years went by, he became one of Jimmy's most trusted associates. The relationship was almost paternal. Jimmy had never had a father, and in some ways, he treated Henry Hill like the son he was mentoring into the family business. Another key member of Jimmy's crew was Tommy DeSimone, a violent, unpredictable psychopath who nonetheless was useful for jobs that required intimidation or, when necessary, murder. DeSimone was everything Jimmy was not: impulsive, hot-tempered, dangerous. But Jimmy understood how to use him. He kept DeSimone on a leash, pointed him at problems. and let him do what he did best. DeSimone was the hammer, and Jimmy was the hand that wielded it. There were others. Angelo Seep, a skilled hijacker. Paolo Licastri, reliable and methodical. Louis Cafora, good with electronics and alarm systems. Jimmy assembled his crew the way a coach builds a team, each man selected for specific skills. Each man aware that loyalty to Jimmy was paramount and disloyalty meant death. Through the 1960s and into the early 1970s, Jimmy Burke's operations expanded. Hijacking remained the bread and butter of his criminal enterprise. The system was well-oiled by now. Informants at trucking companies provided schedules and manifests. The crew would intercept the trucks at carefully selected locations. The goods would be moved to warehouses. Fences would distribute the merchandise. And the money would flow back to Jimmy, who would take his cut and distribute shares to the crew. But Jimmy diversified. He ran loan sharking operations, lending money at interest rates that would make a credit card company blush, then using the threat of violence to ensure repayment. He had gambling operations, bookmaking operations. He had his hands in labor racketeering, controlling unions that could shut down construction sites unless the right people got paid. All of this money flowed through legitimate businesses. Robert's Lounge was just one of several establishments that Jimmy used to wash illegal proceeds. He was scrupulous about paying taxes on his legitimate income. He understood that Al Capone went down for tax evasion, and he had no intention of making that mistake. The relationship with Paul Vario and the Lucchese family remained central to everything. Jimmy kicked up a percentage of his earnings to Vario, and in return, he received protection, access to the family's resources, and a certain immunity from other criminals who might otherwise try to muscle in on his operations. It was a symbiotic relationship. Jimmy made money for himself and for the family, and the family protected Jimmy's operations. But there was another side to Jimmy Burke's business, a side that was whispered about, but rarely discussed openly. Murder. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, people who crossed Jimmy Burke had a tendency to disappear. Informants vanished. Competitors were found dead. People who owed money and refused to pay were never seen again. Jimmy didn't do all the killing himself, though he was certainly capable of it more often. He ordered the killings and let men like Tommy DeSimone handle the actual work. But Jimmy was always careful. Bodies were disposed of professionally, often never found. Witnesses were eliminated. Evidence was destroyed. The police might suspect, but suspicion wasn't proof, and proof was hard to come by when everyone was too terrified to talk. Henry Hill would later estimate that Jimmy Burke was responsible for anywhere from 20 to 50 murders during his criminal career. Though the exact number will never be known, some bodies were found. Most weren't. Some murders were solved. Most remained mysteries. Jimmy Burke operated in the shadows, and he was very good at making problems disappear. The violence was never gratuitous. Jimmy didn't kill for pleasure or from anger. He killed for practical reasons, to protect himself, to eliminate threats, to send messages, to maintain control. In his mind, it was simply business. People who understood the rules and followed them had nothing to fear. People who broke the rules needed to be removed. This philosophy would serve him well for years. It would also be his eventual undoing, because when the Lufthansa heist went down, Jimmy's solution to every problem would be the same solution that had worked for decades: murder. And this time, there would be too many bodies, too much heat, too many questions that even Jimmy Burke's legendary caution couldn't deflect. Despite his criminal activities, Jimmy maintained a relatively normal family life. He and Mickey had children, lived in a comfortable house in Queens, went to church on Sundays. Jimmy was a devoted father. At least by his own standards, he provided for his family, made sure they wanted for nothing, protected them from the reality of how he made his living. His children grew up knowing their father was connected, that he was someone to be respected and feared in the neighborhood. But the details of his criminal activities were kept from them. Jimmy wanted his children to have the opportunities he never had, to grow up with stability and security, rather than the chaos and abandonment that had defined his own childhood. There was a compartmentalization to Jimmy's life. At home, he was a husband and father. At Robert's Lounge, he was a criminal mastermind. He kept these worlds separate, and for many years, he maintained the balance successfully. The brutality of his criminal life never spilled over into his home life. Or at least, that's what he told himself. But the truth was more complicated. The psychological toll of living a double life, of ordering murders while playing catch with his son in the backyard, was something Jimmy never acknowledged. He buried it deep, the same way he buried the trauma of his childhood, the same way he buried his victims, and like those buried things, it would eventually resurface in the form of paranoia, rage, and ultimately self-destruction. By the mid-1970s, Jimmy Burke was at the height of his power. He was wealthy, feared, respected in the underworld. He had built an organization that was efficient and profitable. He had the protection of the Lucchese family and the loyalty of his crew. He had everything a criminal could want. And then, in 1977, an opportunity came along that was too good to pass up. An inside man at Lufthansa Airlines approached Jimmy with information about massive amounts of cash moving through the cargo terminal at JFK Airport. It was the kind of score that could set a man up for life, the kind of job that would go down in criminal history. Jimmy Burke couldn't resist. He began planning what would become the Lufthansa heist, the job that would define his legacy and destroy everything he had built. The opportunity that would change everything came through a man named Louis Werner. Werner was a Lufthansa Airlines cargo worker at JFK Airport, a man with gambling debts and a desperate need for money. Through mutual criminal contacts, Werner's situation came to the attention of Martin Krugman, a bookmaker and wig shop owner who was connected to Jimmy Burke. Krugman was one of those peripheral figures in the criminal world, not a serious criminal himself, but someone who moved in those circles, who did favors and carried messages and occasionally facilitated introductions. When Werner came to him with information about the Lufthansa cargo terminal, Krugman immediately recognized the potential. He brought the information to Jimmy Burke. What Werner told them was almost too good to be true. Lufthansa's cargo terminal at JFK was a hub for international currency exchange. Airlines operating in Germany would send Deutschmarks back to the United States to be converted to dollars. The money would sit in the terminal vault for short periods before being transported to banks. The amounts varied, but on any given day, there could be millions of dollars in untraceable cash in that vault. More importantly, Werner had detailed knowledge of the security procedures. He knew the shift schedules, knew which guards could be intimidated and which ones might be problems, knew the layout of the facility, knew when the most money was likely to be present. He was offering Jimmy Burke a blueprint to a fortune. For most criminals, this would be enough. They would start assembling a crew, planning the job, maybe spending a few weeks on surveillance before making their move. But Jimmy Burke was not most criminals. He spent months planning the Lufthansa heist, treating it with the same meticulous attention to detail that a general might give to planning a military operation. From the summer of 1977 through the fall of 1978, Jimmy Burke and his crew conducted surveillance on the Lufthansa cargo terminal. They didn't rush. They didn't cut corners. They watched and learned and planned. Henry Hill and others made repeated trips to the airport, observing from different vantage points, noting the patterns. When did the armored cars arrive? When did they leave? How many guards were on duty at different times? What routes did they take through the facility? Where were the cameras? Where were the blind spots? Werner continued to provide inside information, updating Jimmy on the security protocols, alerting him to any changes in procedures. Werner's gambling debts were being carried by Krugman and, by extension, by Jimmy Burke. The debt was Werner's leash, keeping him committed to the plan even when his nerves threatened to fail him. Jimmy studied the architectural plans of the terminal, obtained through bribes and connections. He memorized every corridor, every door, every possible entrance and exit. He planned primary routes and backup routes. He identified potential problems and developed solutions for each one. The timing of the heist was crucial. Jimmy determined that the optimal time would be early Monday morning. During the shift change between the night crew and the day crew, there would be fewer people in the terminal, and the confusion of the shift change could be exploited. Werner confirmed that Monday mornings often saw large amounts of cash in the vault for weekend international flights. For a job this big, Jimmy needed the right team. He couldn't use just anyone. The crew had to be professional, experienced, and absolutely loyal. He also needed to keep the crew small enough that the split would be worthwhile but large enough to handle any complications that might arise. Tommy DeSimone was an obvious choice. Despite his volatility, DeSimone was a stone-cold killer who wouldn't hesitate if violence became necessary. More importantly, he was loyal to Jimmy and terrified enough of him to follow orders. Angelo Seep was brought in for his experience with armed robbery. Seep was a professional, someone who had done dozens of jobs and knew how to keep his head when things got tense. Louis Cafura had skills with electronics and alarms that might prove useful. He was also someone Jimmy trusted, a key consideration for a job of this magnitude. Paul Ali Castri, another experienced criminal, rounded out the core crew. There would be others involved in supporting roles: drivers, lookouts, people to help move and store the money. But these were the men who would go into the terminal and execute the robbery. Jimmy briefed each crew member individually, telling them only what they needed to know. He established clear rules. No guns would be fired unless absolutely necessary. No witnesses would be killed if it could be avoided. No one would take anything beyond their assigned share. And most importantly, no one would spend money conspicuously or draw attention to themselves after the job was done. This last rule was emphasized repeatedly. Jimmy understood that the biggest risk to any successful robbery wasn't the robbery itself. It was what happened afterward. Criminals got caught because they couldn't help celebrating, buying flashy cars, throwing money around, attracting attention. Jimmy made it clear. Anyone who violated this rule would be dealt with harshly. The crew nodded and agreed. They understood, or at least they thought they did. As December 1978 approached, the planning entered its final phase. Werner confirmed that the week before Christmas would likely see large amounts of cash moving through the terminal. International holiday travel meant currency exchanges, which meant money in the vault. Jimmy established a rehearsal schedule. The crew met at Robert's Lounge, going through the plan again and again. They role-played different scenarios. What if a guard resisted? What if there was less money than expected? What if police arrived during the robbery? What if the vault couldn't be opened? For every contingency, Jimmy had developed a response. Equipment was acquired. Guns, of course, though Jimmy stressed they were for intimidation only. Ski masks to conceal identities, rope and tape to restrain the guards. A van to transport the crew to and from the terminal. Suitcases and bags to carry the money. A location was secured to store the money after the robbery. Jimmy wasn't going to take it to Robert's Lounge or any location connected to him. The money would go to a safe house where it would sit for weeks or even months until the heat died down. Only then would it be divided and distributed. On the evening of December 10th, 1978, Jimmy gathered the crew for a final briefing. He went through the plan one last time, emphasizing the timing, the roots, the roles each man would play. He reminded them of the rules. He looked each man in the eye and asked if they were ready. Each man said yes. Jimmy felt the familiar calm that came before a job. This was what he did, what he was good at. He had planned everything down to the smallest detail. The crew was solid. The intelligence was good. Tomorrow morning, they would walk into the Lufthansa cargo terminal and walk out with a fortune. What Jimmy didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that this perfect plan contained the seeds of its own destruction. The heist would succeed beyond his wildest expectations. But human nature, greed, weakness, fear, would turn triumph into tragedy. Within 2 years, most of the crew would be dead. Killed on Jimmy's orders, the money would be gone. And Jimmy Burke would be facing life in prison for murders he committed, trying to protect the secret of his greatest success. But on that December evening, as the crew dispersed to get a few hours of sleep before the job, Jimmy Burke allowed himself to feel optimistic. Everything was in place. Tomorrow, history would be made. The van moved through the darkness of pre-dawn Queens, its headlights cutting through the winter cold. Inside were 6 men, each lost in his own thoughts, each wearing dark clothing and carrying the tools of their trade. Jimmy Burke was not in the van. He never went on the actual robberies, a rule he had established years ago. The mastermind stayed back, insulated from direct involvement, waiting for word that the job was done. In the van, Tommy DeSimone was unusually quiet, his typical manic energy replaced by focused concentration. Angelo Seep checked his weapon one final time. Louis Cafora reviewed his mental checklist of the terminal's electronic systems. The others sat in silence, breathing steadily, managing their adrenaline. The driver, following the route they had rehearsed a dozen times, approached JFK Airport from the service roads, avoiding the main terminals where even at this hour there might be traffic. The Lufthansa cargo terminal stood apart from the passenger facilities, a utilitarian building where no one expected drama, where the routine of commerce typically proceeded without incident. At 3:12 a.m., the van pulled up to a service entrance on the side of the building. The location had been chosen carefully. The security cameras didn't quite cover this angle, and the door could be accessed without being visible from the main security station. Louis Werner, the inside man, had confirmed that this door would be unlocked during the shift change, a small detail in the security protocol that was about to cost Lufthansa millions. The crew moved quickly and quietly, entering through the unlocked door. They knew they had perhaps 60 seconds before their presence would be detected. The first person they encountered was Kerry Whalen, the security guard making his rounds. Before Whalen could react, Tommy DeSimone had a gun pressed against his neck. "Don't move, don't make a sound, do exactly what we say, and you'll go home to your family." Whalen, a middle-aged man with a wife and children, was terrified but compliant. This was exactly what Jimmy Burke had planned for. Whalen was cable-tied and moved to a secure location where he couldn't raise an alarm. One down. The crew split up according to the plan. 2 men moved to secure the other employees present during the shift change. At 3 a.m. on a Monday morning, there were only about half a dozen people in the facility. Exactly as Werner had promised, within 5 minutes, all of them had been gathered in one area, secured with plastic ties, ordered to lie face down on the floor. Angelo Seep stood guard over the employees, while the rest of the crew moved toward the vault. This was the critical moment. Everything depended on the vault being accessible, on the combination being what Werner had provided, on no unexpected complications. Louis Cafora approached the vault with the combination Werner had provided. His hands were steady, his movements precise. The first number, the second, the third, the fourth. A pause that seemed to stretch forever then. The sound of the lock mechanism disengaging, the heavy door swinging open, they were in. The vault was a secure room about the size of a large walk-in closet, with metal shelving lining the walls. And on those shelves were bags, lots of bags. Canvas bags marked with airline insignia, bank bags, locked cases. The crew began moving bags out of the vault and into the main cargo area where they could be loaded into the van. It was immediately apparent that there was more money here than they had anticipated. Werner's estimates had been conservative, based on typical volumes, but this was mid-December, the peak of the holiday travel season, and international currency exchanges had been particularly heavy. The vault was packed with cash and jewelry. Tommy DeSimone, never patient under the best circumstances, wanted to grab everything and run. But the plan called for a systematic approach. They had time. Maybe 45 minutes before the shift change would be complete, and people would start noticing something was wrong. The key was to stay calm, stay organized, load everything methodically. As they loaded bag after bag into the van, the magnitude of the score became apparent. The crew had expected maybe 2 or 3 million based on Werner's intelligence. But there was far more than that. 5 million, 6 million, possibly more. Bags of German marks, Swiss francs, US dollars. Locked cases that clearly contained something valuable. Probably jewelry or precious metals. For professional criminals, this should have been the greatest moment of their lives. They had just pulled off the biggest cash robbery in American history. The planning had worked perfectly. No one had been hurt. The vault had opened exactly as promised. They had enough money to set themselves up for life. But in this moment of triumph, the seeds of disaster were already germinating. Because when there's more money than expected, greed takes over. When there's enough wealth to make everyone rich, people start doing math, calculating shares, wondering if their cut is fair, considering whether they might be able to get more. The crew didn't discuss these thoughts at 3:45 a.m. As they loaded the last bags into the van, they were still professionals, still following the plan, but the thoughts were there, in the back of their minds, waiting to surface later when the adrenaline wore off and the reality of what they had just stolen became clear. The van pulled away from the Lufthansa cargo terminal at 4:18 a.m., 53 minutes after the crew had entered the building. Behind them, the employees remained tied on the floor. Under orders not to move for 15 minutes, the crew had been careful. No one had been unnecessarily rough. No shots had been fired. No gratuitous violence had occurred. It had been as clean a robbery as could possibly be executed. The van followed a circuitous route away from the airport, doubling back several times to ensure they weren't being followed. Constantly watching for police presence, the driver maintained careful speed limits, avoided any action that might attract attention. The cargo in the back, millions of dollars in cash and jewelry, was covered with tarps. They reached the safe house, a warehouse in Brooklyn that Jimmy had secured months earlier for exactly this purpose. At 5:02 a.m., the van pulled inside. The warehouse door closed behind them, and only then did the crew allow themselves to breathe. They began unloading the bags, stacking them in the center of the warehouse floor. In the harsh light of the warehouse, they could finally see the full scope of what they had stolen. Bag after bag of currency, locked jewelry cases, more wealth than any of them had seen in their lives. Jimmy Burke arrived at 5:30 a.m. He had been waiting at Robert's lounge, managing his nerves, trusting his crew to execute the plan. When the call came that they were at the safe house, he drove over immediately. What he saw when he walked into that warehouse must have exceeded even his expectations. The bags were piled high, unopened, waiting to be counted. Jimmy's expression remained neutral. He never showed emotion, never let anyone see what he was thinking, but inside, He must have been calculating the magnitude of what they had just accomplished. The count took hours. They opened each bag, sorted the currency by denomination and type, verified the contents of the jewelry cases. The final tally was staggering. Approximately $6 million in cash and $875,000 in jewelry and precious metals. At 1978 values, adjusted for inflation, that was close to $30 million in today's money. Jimmy divided the money according to the predetermined plan. As the mastermind, he took the largest share, roughly a third of the total. The crew members who had gone into the terminal received substantial cuts. Werner, the inside man, received his cut, though less than the active participants. Others who had provided support, drivers, lookouts, people who had helped with intelligence, received smaller shares. Even the smallest share was more money than most of these men had ever seen, and therein lay the problem. Because Jimmy Burke, calculating and paranoid, knew something that the crew members were too elated to consider. This much money brought this much heat. The FBI would be all over this case immediately. There would be massive pressure to solve it. Every criminal informant in New York would be questioned. Every known associate of every major criminal would be surveilled. The only way the crew would get away with this was if everyone did exactly what Jimmy had told them to do. Take the money. Hide it. Don't spend it conspicuously. Don't change their lifestyles. Don't talk to anyone, not even family, not even other criminals. The money needed to be buried, sometimes literally, and left untouched for at least a year, maybe longer. Jimmy repeated these instructions to each crew member as they received their shares. He looked them in the eye. He made sure they understood that this wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. He told them what would happen to anyone who brought heat on the crew. They all nodded. They all understood. They all promised to follow the rules. And within weeks, several of them would be dead. Because they couldn't help themselves. Because when you give desperate, greedy, impulsive criminals more money than they've ever had, they do what desperate, greedy, impulsive criminals always do. They make stupid mistakes. But on the morning of December 11th, 1978, as the crew dispersed with their shares of the biggest robbery in American history, they were heroes of the underworld. They had pulled off the impossible. They were set for life. They had no idea that most of them had less than 2 years to live. The Lufthansa heist was discovered at 6:47 a.m. on December 11th, when the day shift supervisor arrived and found the night crew still bound on the floor. Within minutes, the FBI was notified. Within hours, it was national news. Within days, it was the biggest criminal investigation in the country. The FBI assigned a massive task force to the case. They interviewed every Lufthansa employee, investigating their finances, their associations, their possible connections to organized crime. They put surveillance on every known criminal in Queens and Brooklyn. They activated every informant they had, offering deals, threatening prosecution, doing everything possible to develop leads for Jimmy Burke, sitting in Robert's lounge and watching the news coverage. This was expected. He had planned for this level of attention. What he needed now was for his crew to remain calm, remain silent, and above all, remain invisible. For about 2 weeks, that's exactly what happened. The crew members went about their normal lives. They showed up at their regular haunts. They didn't flash money around to external observation. Nothing had changed in their lives. But inside, the pressure was building. Because these men, most of them anyway, were not built for patience. They had money burning holes in their pockets. More money than they had ever imagined, and they couldn't spend it. They couldn't tell anyone about their success. They had to watch the news coverage of the heist and keep their mouths shut, while everyone speculated about who could have pulled off such a brilliant crime. The first to break was Parnell Stacks Edwards. Stacks was a minor participant in the heist, responsible for disposing of the van used in the robbery. His job had been simple: drive the van to a compactor in Jersey, watch it be crushed and destroyed, eliminating any forensic evidence. It was the kind of simple task that even a low-level criminal should be able to handle without difficulty. But Stacks Edwards got high and forgot. The van sat for days in a location where it could be, and eventually was discovered by police when the FBI found the van. They processed it for evidence and found enough fingerprints and forensic material to potentially identify the crew. For Jimmy Burke, this was an unforgivable breach. The plan had been perfect. Everything had been accounted for. And Stacks Edwards, in a moment of drugged stupidity, had put the entire crew at risk. Jimmy's response was immediate and brutal. On December 18, 1978, just 1 week after the heist, Tommy DeSimone showed up at Stacks Edwards' apartment. Stacks answered the door, probably expecting a friend or a dealer. DeSimone shot him 6 times in the head and chest. Stacks Edwards became the first casualty of the Lufthansa heist, killed not by police or rivals, but by his own crew. The murder sent a message to the other crew members: follow the rules or die. But it also marked the beginning of a pattern that would define the next 2 years. Because once Jimmy started killing to protect the secret, he couldn't stop. In January 1979, Martin Krugman, the bookmaker who had brought the opportunity to Jimmy in the first place, made a fatal mistake. He started complaining about his share. Krugman felt he deserved more money as the person who had brought the deal to Jimmy. He started making noises, talking to people, suggesting that maybe he wasn't being treated fairly. For Jimmy Burke, complaints were tantamount to threats. If Krugman was unhappy, he might talk to the wrong people. If he was talking to people about money, he was talking about the heist. If he was talking about the heist, he was a liability. Martin Krugman disappeared in January 1979. His body was never found. To this day, no one knows exactly where or how he was killed. But everyone in the crew knew who had ordered it and why. Then came Louis Werner, the inside man. Werner had received his cut, but the FBI was questioning him repeatedly. He was an obvious suspect as an inside employee, and the pressure was getting to him. Werner started acting nervous, looking over his shoulder, behaving in ways that suggested guilt. Jimmy Burke couldn't allow Werner to crack under pressure. In February 1979, Werner was scheduled to disappear. But Werner, sensing the danger, went to the FBI first. He didn't confess to the heist. He couldn't, because that would mean admitting his own role. But he started cooperating in other ways, providing information about other crimes, seeking protection. This partial cooperation saved Werner's life, but signed the death warrants of others. Because now Jimmy knew he had someone cooperating with the FBI, even if only marginally, and his paranoia reached new heights. What followed was a bloodbath, unique in the annals of organized crime. Jimmy Burke, acting on a combination of genuine security concerns and paranoid delusion, began systematically eliminating everyone connected to the heist. Louis Cafora and his wife Joanna disappeared in March 1979. Their bodies were never found. Cafora had made the mistake of taking his wife on a vacation to Florida, paying with cash, drawing attention. His wife's only crime was being married to him. Jimmy Burke decided they both needed to go. Angelo Seep lasted slightly longer. He was more careful than the others, more professional. But in July 1979, Seep was found shot to death in his car in Queens. The murder was made to look like a random robbery, but everyone in the underworld knew the truth. Paolo Licastri disappeared in June 1979. Robert McMahon, who had helped with the logistics of the robbery, vanished in July. Teresa Ferrara, a girlfriend of one of the crew members who knew too much, was found murdered in January 1980. Tommy DeSimone, the stone-cold killer who had done much of Jimmy's dirty work, made the mistake of murdering a made man in the Gambino family over an unrelated dispute. In January 1979, DeSimone disappeared, probably killed on orders from the Gambino family in retaliation. Jimmy didn't protect him because DeSimone had become a liability anyway. Too violent, too unpredictable. By the end of 1980, approximately 10 people connected to the Lufthansa heist were dead. Some bodies were found. Most weren't. Some murders were officially solved. Most remained mysteries. But in the criminal underworld, everyone knew the truth. Jimmy the Gent Burke was cleaning house, eliminating anyone who could connect him to the greatest robbery in American history. Through all of this, Henry Hill watched in horror as his friends and associates were systematically murdered. Hill had not been directly involved in the heist itself. Jimmy had kept him out of the actual robbery. But he knew about it, knew the participants, knew everything. And Hill was beginning to realize that eventually Jimmy would come for him too. The relationship between Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill had always been complicated. Jimmy had mentored Hill, treated him almost like a son. But Jimmy had also taught Hill that in the criminal world, sentiment meant nothing compared to security. If Hill became a liability, their history wouldn't save him. Hill started using cocaine heavily, spiraling into addiction and paranoia. The cocaine use made him more erratic, more likely to talk when he should stay silent, more likely to make the kind of mistakes that got people killed in Jimmy Burke's orbit. In 1980, Hill was arrested on narcotics charges unrelated to the Lufthansa heist, facing significant prison time with the knowledge that Jimmy Burke had killed a dozen people to protect the secret of the robbery. Henry Hill made a decision that would change everything. He decided to cooperate with the FBI. Hill's decision to turn informant was driven by fear, self-preservation, and the knowledge that he was a dead man if he stayed loyal. The FBI offered him a deal: testify against Jimmy Burke and Paul Vario, enter witness protection, start a new life. For a man facing the choice between prison or death, it wasn't a difficult decision. Starting in 1980, Henry Hill told the FBI everything. He gave them details about the Lufthansa heist, though his information was limited since he hadn't directly participated. More importantly, he gave them information about other crimes, other murders, the entire structure of Jimmy Burke's criminal organization. The FBI couldn't charge Jimmy with the Lufthansa heist directly. Despite Hill's testimony, there wasn't enough physical evidence, and too many potential witnesses were dead. But Hill's information gave them leverage for other charges. For Jimmy Burke, Hill's betrayal was both expected and devastating. Jimmy had always known that someone might flip, might save themselves by betraying the crew. But having it be Henry Hill, his protege, the kid he had mentored, added a personal dimension to the betrayal that must have cut deep. Though Jimmy Burke would never admit it, never show emotion. The betrayal by Henry Hill was perhaps the only time in his life when someone's disloyalty hurt him on a personal level. Everyone else who died or disappeared or got arrested was just business. Henry Hill was different. By late 1980, the Lufthansa crew had been decimated. Of the approximately 15 people directly involved in or knowledgeable about the heist, more than half were dead. The others were either in witness protection, in prison on other charges, or living in constant fear that they would be next. The $6 million in cash had vanished. Some had been spent. Some had been buried or hidden and never recovered. Some had been taken by crew members before they were killed, its location dying with them. Jimmy Burke's share, the largest portion, was also hidden, and he would never get a chance to spend most of it. The jewelry, worth nearly $1 million, had been difficult to fence. Much of it was too identifiable, too hot to sell. Some pieces were broken down and sold piecemeal. Others were simply thrown away because the risk of trying to sell them was too great. In the end, the biggest cash robbery in American history had netted Jimmy Burke nothing but a pile of corpses and the focused attention of every law enforcement agency in the country. His paranoid attempt to protect himself by eliminating witnesses had ironically guaranteed that the Lufthansa heist would remain in the headlines, that the investigation would never be closed, that he would remain under scrutiny for the rest of his life. But Jimmy Burke still had one more lesson to teach the underworld, that even when caught, even when facing life in prison, he would never admit guilt, never show weakness, never give the authorities the satisfaction of a confession. Because in 1982, Jimmy Burke was finally arrested. But it wasn't for the Lufthansa heist. It was for a murder that no one had connected to him until Henry Hill started talking, the murder of Richard Eaton, a case that would put Jimmy away for the rest of his life. By early 1981, the FBI had assembled a substantial case against Jimmy Burke. But it wasn't the case they wanted, despite Henry Hill's cooperation. Despite the physical evidence from the Van Stacks Edwards had failed to destroy. Despite the testimony from various sources, they couldn't build a prosecutable case for the Lufthansa heist itself. The problem was fundamental. Most of the key witnesses were dead, killed on Jimmy's orders. The money had vanished. The jewelry had been fenced or destroyed. Louis Werner, the inside man, had limited knowledge of the larger operation and was facing his own legal problems. Henry Hill's testimony was valuable, but as a cooperating witness with his own criminal history, his credibility could be challenged in court. The FBI needed something more concrete. They needed a murder case with physical evidence, with testimony that couldn't be easily discredited, with a body and a clear motive and a chain of evidence that would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. They found it in the case of Richard Eaton. Richard Eaton was a small-time criminal and drug dealer who made the fatal mistake of doing business with Jimmy Burke and then talking about it. Eaton had been involved in some drug trafficking with members of Jimmy's crew. When he was arrested on narcotics charges in 1979, Eaton had started making noises about cooperating with prosecutors to reduce his sentence for Jimmy Burke. This was the same problem that had led to the deaths of a dozen others. A potential informant who might trade information for leniency. Jimmy's solution was the same solution he had employed throughout his criminal career. Eliminate the threat. In April 1979, Richard Eaton disappeared. His body was discovered weeks later, buried in a shallow grave in upstate New York. He had been shot multiple times. The murder investigation initially went nowhere. Eaton was a drug dealer with enemies, and the police had no clear leads. But when Henry Hill started cooperating in 1980, he provided information about the Eaton murder. He gave the FBI details about who had killed Eaton, on whose orders where the body had been disposed, and most importantly, physical evidence that could corroborate his testimony. This was the case the FBI had been looking for. They had a body. They had a cooperating witness with detailed knowledge. They had forensic evidence. They had other witnesses who could place Jimmy Burke with Eaton shortly before the murder. They had a prosecutable case. On April 1st, 1982, FBI agents arrested Jimmy Burke at Robert's Lounge. He was charged with the murder of Richard Eaton. As the agents read him his rights, Jimmy Burke displayed the same calm demeanor he had shown throughout his criminal career. He didn't protest. He didn't claim innocence. He simply invoked his right to an attorney and said nothing else. The arrest was national news. The authorities made sure to mention in press conferences that Burke was a suspect in the Lufthansa heist, though he was being charged with an unrelated murder. They wanted the public to understand that they were taking down one of the most dangerous criminals in New York. Even if they couldn't charge him with his most famous crime, Jimmy Burke was held without bail. Given the severity of the charges and his extensive criminal history, the judge determined that he was a flight risk and a danger to potential witnesses. Jimmy was transferred to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan to await trial. For a man who had spent his entire adult life operating in the shadows, pulling strings, orchestrating crimes from the safety of Robert's Lounge, being in federal custody must have been a jarring change. But Jimmy adapted. He maintained his silence. He met with his attorneys and planned his defense. He sent messages to associates on the outside, making sure his family was taken care of, ensuring that certain people remained silent. The trial began in October 1982. The prosecution's case was built primarily on Henry Hill's testimony, supported by forensic evidence and testimony from other witnesses. Hill took the stand and told the jury everything he knew about Jimmy Burke's criminal activities, including detailed accounts of the Eaton murder. Hill was a problematic witness. He was a confessed criminal, a drug addict, a man who had betrayed his associates to save himself. The defense attorneys tore into him on cross-examination, attacking his credibility, his motives, his mental state. They portrayed him as a liar who would say anything to avoid prison. But Hill's testimony was corroborated by physical evidence. The prosecution presented ballistics reports, forensic analysis of the burial site, phone records placing Jimmy Burke in contact with the killers around the time of the murder. They presented testimony from other witnesses who confirmed elements of Hill's story. Jimmy Burke never took the stand in his own defense. His attorneys advised against it, knowing that if Jimmy testified, the prosecution could bring up his entire criminal history. Better to remain silent, to force the prosecution to prove their case without giving them any additional ammunition. The trial lasted 5 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On November 16, 1982, they returned with a verdict: guilty of murder in the second degree. Jimmy Burke showed no emotion as the verdict was read. He had understood from the moment of his arrest that this was a likely outcome. The evidence was strong. The witnesses were credible enough. The jury was convinced. On December 12, 1982, Jimmy Burke stood before the judge for sentencing. The prosecution asked for the maximum: life in prison without the possibility of parole. They argued that Burke was a career criminal, a murderer, a man who had shown no remorse for his crimes, and who would certainly kill again if given the opportunity. The defense argued for leniency, which in a murder case meant anything less than a life sentence. They painted Jimmy as a product of his environment, abandoned as a child, failed by the foster care system, forced into a life of crime by circumstances beyond his control. It was a standard defense strategy, attempting to humanize the defendant, to make the jury see him as more than just a monster. The judge, who had presided over the trial and heard all the evidence, was not sympathetic. In his sentencing statement, he noted that Jimmy Burke had chosen a life of violence and crime, that he had shown no remorse for his victims, and that he represented a continuing danger to society. The sentence was 20 years to life in prison. Given Jimmy's age, he was 51 at the time. It was essentially a death sentence. He would be eligible for parole after 20 years. But given his criminal history and the nature of his crimes, parole was extremely unlikely. Jimmy Burke was transferred to Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York, one of the most notorious maximum security prisons in the country. He would spend the rest of his life there, in the months following his sentencing. As the reality of life imprisonment set in, Jimmy Burke had time to reflect on the choices that had brought him to this point. He could have walked away from the Lufthansa heist. He could have been satisfied with his successful hijacking operation, with Robert's Lounge, with the comfortable life he had built. He could have recognized that the heist, no matter how tempting, carried risks that outweighed the potential rewards, but that wasn't who Jimmy Burke was. He was a man who had spent his entire life taking risks, outsmarting the system. believing that his intelligence and planning could overcome any obstacle. The Lufthansa heist had been irresistible precisely because it was difficult, because it required the kind of meticulous planning and flawless execution that he prided himself on. And he had pulled it off. The heist itself had been perfect. No one had been hurt. The vault had opened as planned. They had escaped with millions. By any measure, it had been a success. What destroyed him wasn't the heist. It was what came after, the paranoia, the murders, the inability to trust even his closest associates, the transformation from criminal mastermind to brutal killer, eliminating witnesses one by one, creating a trail of bodies that guaranteed he would never escape scrutiny. In quieter moments, Jimmy Burke might have recognized the irony. He had committed the perfect crime and then destroyed himself trying to cover it up. The very caution and paranoia that had kept him out of prison for decades had become the instrument of his downfall. But these reflections, if he had them, remained private. Jimmy Burke never admitted guilt, never expressed remorse, never cooperated with authorities, even when it might have reduced his sentence. He maintained the code he had lived by. Never talk, never show weakness, take whatever consequences come with stoic silence. It was a code that would stay with him until his final breath. 14 years later, in a prison hospital bed, his body ravaged by cancer, his criminal empire long since dismantled, his legend secure, but his freedom gone forever. Attica Correctional Facility, located in upstate New York, was and remains one of the most notorious maximum security prisons in America. It was here that Jimmy Burke would spend the final 14 years of his life. A man who had once commanded respect and fear throughout New York's underworld, now reduced to an inmate number, living in a cell measuring 9 by 6 feet. But prison, for a man like Jimmy Burke, was not the complete reduction to powerlessness that it might be for others. Jimmy was a connected guy, associated with the Lucchese crime family, and that status carried weight even behind bars. He had money on the outside, resources he could still access. He had a reputation that commanded respect from other inmates. In prison, Jimmy maintained his dignity and his silence. He adapted to the routine, to the degradation, to the loss of freedom, without complaint. Other inmates who knew who he was treated him with deference. Those who didn't quickly learn that Jimmy Burke, even in his 50s, even in prison, was not someone to cross. He had visitors, though not as many as in the early years. His wife Mickey came regularly, loyal to the end despite everything he had done. His children visited, though less frequently as time went on and their own lives took them in different directions. Associates from his criminal career sent messages through intermediaries, maintaining the connections that defined his identity. But prison is ultimately about loss. Loss of freedom, loss of time, loss of the life you might have lived. And for Jimmy Burke, there was the particular loss of knowing that the Lufthansa heist, the greatest achievement of his criminal career, would never be officially solved, that he would never be charged with the crime that defined his legacy. Outside the prison walls, the FBI continued their investigation of the Lufthansa heist. The case remained technically open, with agents following leads, interviewing witnesses, hoping to build a prosecutable case against Jimmy Burke and any surviving associates. But the challenges were insurmountable. Most of the crew was dead, killed in the paranoid bloodbath of 1979-1980. Henry Hill, the key witness, had already testified to everything he knew, and it hadn't been enough to bring charges. The physical evidence had largely disappeared. The money was gone, scattered or buried or spent in 1985. While still serving his sentence for the Eaton murder, Jimmy was tried and convicted on additional charges related to a point-shaving scandal at Boston College. The charges stemmed from a scheme to fix basketball games for betting purposes. A relatively minor crime compared to murder and robbery, but one that carried its own prison sentence. The conviction added 12 years to his sentence, ensuring that even if he somehow won parole on the Eaton murder conviction, he would remain in prison for the foreseeable future. Jimmy was now looking at the possibility of spending the rest of his natural life behind bars. For a man who valued freedom and control above almost everything, this must have been a devastating realization. But Jimmy never showed it. He maintained his composure, accepted the additional sentence without complaint, and continued his life in prison with the same disciplined routine he had established. Despite his imprisonment, Jimmy Burke maintained connections to the outside world. He couldn't order murders anymore. Those days were over, but he could still send messages, still influence events, still command a certain respect from the criminal underworld. He communicated with associates through his attorney, through visitors, through coded messages and letters that were carefully worded to avoid obvious evidence of criminal activity. He kept track of what was happening in his old territory, who was operating, who was successful, who had been arrested. Paul Vario, his old mentor and boss, was also in federal prison, serving time on various charges. The two men, who had once worked together running criminal operations worth millions, were now just two more aging inmates. Their power and influence reduced to memories and legends. The criminal landscape was changing. The old mafia families that had dominated New York for decades were under assault from federal prosecutors using RICO statutes and witness protection programs. The code of silence that had once been sacrosanct was crumbling as more and more criminals chose cooperation over loyalty. The world Jimmy Burke had known was disappearing. In the early 1990s, Jimmy Burke's health began to decline. He had been a relatively healthy man for most of his life, but years of stress, the confines of prison, and age were taking their toll. He developed various ailments, none immediately life-threatening, but collectively debilitating. Then, in 1995, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. It had metastasized by the time it was discovered. Spreading to other organs, the prognosis was grim. Months, maybe a year if he was lucky. The prison medical facilities provided basic treatment, but there was little they could do for advanced cancer. Jimmy was moved to the prison hospital wing, where he received palliative care designed to manage his pain rather than cure his disease. As his condition worsened, there were discussions about compassionate release, the possibility of allowing him to die at home with his family rather than in a prison hospital. Such releases were sometimes granted to terminally ill inmates who were deemed no longer a threat to society. But the FBI and prosecutors opposed any release for Jimmy Burke. They argued that he remained dangerous, that he maintained criminal connections, that releasing him would be an insult to his victims and their families. The request for compassionate release was denied. Jimmy Burke would die in prison, just as the judge had intended when sentencing him 14 years earlier. In early April 1996, it became clear that Jimmy Burke had only days left. The cancer had ravaged his body. He was in constant pain despite medication. He was barely conscious for much of the time. His family was allowed extended visitation in those final days. Mickey was there, sitting by his bedside, holding his hand, maintaining the loyalty she had shown throughout their marriage, despite everything he had done. His children came to say goodbye to a father they had never fully known, whose criminal life had always been a shadow over their own. Did Jimmy Burke, in those final hours, reflect on his life? Did he feel remorse for the murders he had ordered, the lives he had destroyed? Did he regret the choices that had brought him to this end, dying in a prison hospital rather than peacefully at home surrounded by family? We'll never know. Jimmy Burke maintained his silence to the end. He never confessed to the Lufthansa heist. He never admitted to the murders, even those he had been convicted of. He never cooperated with authorities, never sought redemption through revelation. On April 13th, 1996, at the age of 64, James Burke died. The official cause of death was cancer. But in a larger sense, he died from the life he had chosen, from the paranoid violence that had defined his final years of freedom, from the inability to trust anyone, even his closest associates. Jimmy Burke's funeral was a small, private affair. There would be no grand send-off, no procession of hundreds of mourners like the funerals of some mafia bosses. Most of the people who had known him in his criminal life were either dead, in prison, or in witness protection. The few who remained free were cautious about being seen at the funeral of such a notorious criminal. Mickey and the children were there, along with a handful of relatives and a few old friends who were willing to risk the FBI surveillance that would certainly be photographing everyone in attendance. It was a Catholic service. Despite everything, Jimmy had maintained at least the forms of his childhood faith. He was buried in a cemetery on Long Island, his grave marked with a simple headstone. There was no mention of his criminal career, no acknowledgement of the Lufthansa heist, or the murders, or the life he had actually lived. Just his name and dates, as though he had been an ordinary man living an ordinary life. In the weeks following his death, obituaries in the New York papers told the story of his life, focusing primarily on the Lufthansa heist and his portrayal in the film Goodfellas to the public. Jimmy Burke was a figure of fascination, a real-life gangster from a world most people only knew from movies and television. But to the families of Richard Eaton, Stax Edwards, Martin Krugman, and the dozen others who died on Jimmy's orders, he was simply a murderer who had finally faced justice, even if incomplete justice. He had died in prison, which was something, but he had never been held accountable for most of his crimes, never expressed remorse, never acknowledged the pain he had caused. Jimmy Burke's death left many questions unanswered. The most obvious: what happened to the money? $6 million in cash had been stolen in the Lufthansa heist. Some had been distributed to the crew, some of whom had spent it before being killed. But Jimmy's share, the largest portion, had never been found? Had he hidden it somewhere? Buried it in a location only he knew? Had it been seized by law enforcement in raids he never knew about? Had it been stolen by associates after his arrest? The money became the stuff of legend, with treasure hunters and amateur detectives occasionally claiming to have leads on its location. The truth is probably more mundane. The money was likely spent slowly over the years before Jimmy's arrest, laundered through legitimate businesses used to maintain his operations and support his family, dissipated gradually until there was nothing left to find. But the mystery persists, part of the legend of the Lufthansa heist. Another question: exactly how many people did Jimmy Burke kill or order killed? He was convicted of 2 murders, but law enforcement estimated the real number was anywhere from 20 to 50. Most bodies were never found. Most murders were never officially solved. The exact count will never be known. And perhaps the most interesting question: if Jimmy Burke had simply followed his own rules, if he had resisted the paranoid impulse to murder everyone connected to the heist, would he have gotten away with it? The heist itself was nearly perfect. The mistakes that led to its unraveling were all human mistakes, failures of discipline and greed. If the crew had stayed quiet, stayed patient, avoided drawing attention to themselves, might they all have lived to enjoy their shares? It's a question that haunted Henry Hill for the rest of his life. Hill, who lived in witness protection until his death in 2012, gave numerous interviews about the Lufthansa heist and Jimmy Burke. He always came back to the same conclusion: Jimmy's paranoia destroyed what his genius had created. The perfect crime was ruined by imperfect execution in the aftermath. In 1986, writer Nicholas Pileggi published Wise Guy, a non-fiction book based on extensive interviews with Henry Hill. The book told story of Hill's life in organized crime, including detailed accounts of the Lufthansa heist and his relationship with Jimmy Burke, referred to in the book by the pseudonym Jimmy Conway, to avoid legal issues while Burke was still alive. The book caught the attention of director Martin Scorsese, who saw in it the potential for a definitive film about the reality of mob life. Stripped of the romanticism that had characterized films like The Godfather, Scorsese and Pileggi collaborated on a screenplay, and in 1990, Goodfellas was released. The film, starring Ray Liotta as Henry Hill, Robert De Niro as Jimmy Conway, Burke, and Joe Pesci as Tommy DeVito Desimone, was a critical and commercial success. It presented organized crime not as a noble enterprise with a code of honor, but as a brutal, greedy, paranoid world where loyalty lasted only as long as it was convenient, and where murder was a routine business solution. De Niro's portrayal of Jimmy Burke, as Jimmy Conway, captured the contradictions of the man, calm, methodical, intelligent, but ultimately driven by paranoia to destroy everything he had built. The film's depiction of the aftermath of the Lufthansa heist, with Jimmy systematically eliminating the crew members, remains one of the most chilling sequences in cinema. Goodfellas is based on true events, but like all films, it takes artistic liberties. The character of Jimmy Conway is based on Jimmy Burke, but differs in important ways. The film couldn't use Burke's real name, while he was still alive, and couldn't portray him as Italian, which he wasn't, while maintaining the fiction that he was a maid, member of the Mafia, which he never could be as an Irishman. The film also compressed timelines, combined characters, and simplified certain events for narrative clarity. The reality of the Lufthansa heist and its aftermath was more complex, more chaotic, and in some ways more brutal than what appeared on screen. But the core truth of the film, that Jimmy Burke was a brilliant criminal whose paranoia led him to murder his own crew and ultimately destroy himself, is accurate. The film captured the essence of who Jimmy Burke was, even if the specific details were altered for many people, particularly those too young to remember the actual events. Goodfellas defines their understanding of Jimmy Burke and the Lufthansa heist. The film ensured that Jimmy's legacy would be not just a footnote in criminal history, but a central part of American popular culture, even after Jimmy Burke's death. The Lufthansa heist remained a subject of investigation. The case was technically still open, and the FBI continued to follow leads whenever they emerged. In 2013, nearly 35 years after the heist, the FBI made a series of arrests related to the case. Vincent Asaro, an aging mobster connected to the Bonanno crime family, was charged with being involved in the heist. The arrests made headlines. Here was proof that law enforcement had never forgotten the Lufthansa heist, that they were still pursuing anyone who had been involved. The case against Asaro went to trial in 2015. Prosecutors presented evidence that Asaro had been part of the crew that pulled off the heist and had received a share of the proceeds. But the case was weak. It relied heavily on testimony from a cooperating witness whose credibility was questionable, and there was little physical evidence linking Asaro to the crime after 35 years. In November 2015, a jury acquitted Asaro of all charges. The verdict was seen as a blow to prosecutors, but it also highlighted the fundamental challenge of prosecuting a case from 1978. Witnesses were dead, memories had faded, evidence had been lost, and the passage of time had made it nearly impossible to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The Lufthansa heist, it seemed, would remain officially unsolved despite everyone knowing who was responsible. Why does the Lufthansa heist and Jimmy Burke's story continue to fascinate us more than 4 decades later? There are several reasons. First, there's the sheer audacity of the crime. $6 million in cash stolen in a single night, remains one of the largest cash robberies in American history. The planning, the execution, the perfect coordination required. It appeals to our fascination with criminal genius, with the idea that someone could outsmart the system so completely. Second, there's the tragedy of the aftermath. The heist itself harmed no one. No shots were fired. No one was injured. But the paranoid elimination of the crew turned a victimless property crime into a blood-soaked massacre. There's a Greek tragedy quality to it, the idea that success contained the seeds of destruction, that the perfect crime destroyed itself. Third, there's the character of Jimmy Burke himself. He embodies contradictions that make him endlessly interesting. The polite gentleman who was a ruthless killer, the abandoned child who became a feared crime boss, the brilliant planner whose paranoia led to impulsive violence, the man who pulled off the perfect crime and then destroyed himself covering it up. Finally, there's the cultural moment. The Lufthansa heist occurred at a time when organized crime was beginning its long decline, when the old mafia families were starting to crumble under pressure from federal prosecution, and the old mafia family, erosion of the code of silence. Jimmy Burke and the Lufthansa heist represent the end of an era, the last gasp of the traditional mob before it was largely dismantled by RICO statutes and witness protection programs. What lessons can be drawn from the story of Jimmy Burke and the Lufthansa heist? For law enforcement, the lesson is about the importance of witness protection programs and the value of turning criminals against their former associates. Henry Hill's testimony didn't directly lead to a conviction for the Lufthansa heist, but it provided valuable intelligence and helped convict Jimmy Burke of other crimes. The willingness to offer deals to cooperating witnesses, controversial as it is, proved effective in bringing down organized crime figures who otherwise might have remained untouchable. For criminals, if any are paying attention, the lesson is about the danger of paranoia and the self-destructive nature of trying to eliminate all witnesses. Jimmy Burke's systematic murder of his crew drew far more attention to the heist than the robbery itself would have generated. If he had simply enforced discipline, kept everyone quiet, and been patient, the crew might have gotten away with it. Instead, the body count guaranteed that law enforcement would never stop investigating. For the rest of us, the lesson is perhaps about the ultimate futility of crime as a path to lasting success. Jimmy Burke was, by any measure, a successful criminal for most of his life. He made millions, avoided prison for decades, commanded respect and fear, but he died alone in a prison hospital, having lost everything, having betrayed the very values of loyalty and family that he claimed to uphold. Of all the mysteries surrounding the Lufthansa heist, the most enduring is the question of the money: $6 million in cash, $875,000 in jewelry. Where did it all go? Some was certainly spent by crew members before they were killed. Stax Edwards bought a Cadillac, which cost him his life. Others made purchases, took trips, paid off debts, but these expenditures account for only a fraction of the total Jimmy Burke share, estimated at $2 million or more, has never been found. Law enforcement searched every property connected to him, froze his assets, followed every possible lead. Nothing. The most likely explanation is that Jimmy laundered the money slowly through his various legitimate businesses, that it was spent over time on lawyer fees and maintaining his operations and supporting his family, that it dissipated gradually rather than sitting in a cache somewhere waiting to be discovered. But there are other theories. Some believe Jimmy buried a significant portion of the money somewhere in New York, a location known only to him, and that it remains buried to this day. Others think he gave it to trusted associates who have kept its location secret. Still others believe law enforcement seized it in raids, but never publicly acknowledged the recovery to protect investigative methods. The truth will probably never be known, If Jimmy Burke did bury money, he took the location to his grave. If he gave it to others, they've kept the secret for more than 40 years. The $6 million has become a modern buried treasure, the subject of speculation and occasional treasure hunts, part of the enduring legend of the Lufthansa heist. While Goodfellas is the most famous cultural product of the Lufthansa heist, it's not the only one. The heist has been referenced in countless books, documentaries, television shows, and articles. It appears in true crime anthologies, in histories of organized crime, in studies of famous robberies. The heist has become shorthand for a certain type of crime, the perfect plan undone by human weakness. It's used in criminology courses to illustrate the challenges of managing criminal conspiracies, the difficulties of maintaining secrecy among groups, the tendency of criminals to self-destruct through greed and paranoia for writers and filmmakers. The Lufthansa heist provides a template for heist stories. The careful planning, the successful execution, the tragic aftermath. Elements of the heist appear in fictional crime stories, sometimes directly acknowledged, sometimes simply absorbed into the cultural DNA of how we tell stories about robberies and criminals. In all the focus on Jimmy Burke and the criminal aspects of the Lufthansa heist, it's easy to forget that there were real victims beyond the insurance companies that covered the losses. There were the employees of Lufthansa, terrorized during the robbery, who had to live with the trauma of having guns pointed at them, of being bound and threatened. Some of them struggled with anxiety and fear for years afterward. There were the families of the murdered crew members. Whatever those men's crimes, they had families who loved them. Children who grew up without fathers, wives who became widows. The murders destroyed families, created orphans, inflicted trauma that rippled through generations. There was Richard Eaton, the man Jimmy was convicted of murdering, who died simply because he might have cooperated with prosecutors. His family lost a son, a brother, a father. There were the neighborhoods and communities affected by organized crime, the businesses that paid protection money, the workers who paid usurious interest rates on loan shark loans, the victims of the various crimes that Jimmy Burke and his organization committed over decades. The story of Jimmy Burke is fascinating, but it shouldn't be romanticized. He was a murderer, a criminal who chose a life of violence and greed, and who destroyed many lives in pursuit of wealth and power. The fact that he was intelligent and had a difficult childhood doesn't excuse what he did. Jimmy Burke died in 1996, but in many ways, the world he represented had died years earlier. The traditional organized crime structure of the mid-20th century, with its strict hierarchies and codes of silence, had been largely dismantled by the time of his death. The RICO statutes, allowing prosecutors to charge entire criminal organizations rather than just individual criminals, proved devastating to the mafia. Witness protection programs encouraged cooperation, breaking down the code of silence that had protected mob bosses for generations. Surveillance technology made it harder to conduct criminal business without being recorded. By the 1990s, the 5 families of New York were shadows of their former selves. Many bosses were in prison. Many operations had been shut down. The younger generation of criminals was less interested in the traditional mafia structure and more interested in drug trafficking, which the old bosses had largely avoided. Jimmy Burke's life spanned the golden age of American organized crime and its decline. He came of age when the mob was powerful, when criminals like him could operate with relative impunity. He died when that world was largely gone, replaced by a new reality where cooperation with law enforcement was common and the old codes meant nothing. In that sense, his story is not just about one criminal, but about an entire era of American crime coming to an end. And so we come to the end of the story of Jimmy the Gent Burke, a man born into abandonment who built himself into one of the most feared and successful criminals in New York. only to destroy everything he had created through paranoia and violence. The Lufthansa heist remains the biggest cash robbery in American history. It stands as a monument to criminal planning and audacity, but it also stands as a cautionary tale about the self-destructive nature of crime, about how even perfect execution can't overcome human weakness. Jimmy Burke was, by all accounts, a genius. He had the intelligence and discipline to succeed at almost anything he put his mind to. He could have been a successful businessman, a military strategist, an organizational leader. Instead, he chose crime, and that choice, made early and reinforced throughout his life, led inevitably to a prison cell and a lonely death. The money, $6 million in 1978 currency, has never been found. It vanished like morning mist, scattered and hidden and lost. All that wealth, which should have set up the crew for life, instead bought nothing but graves and prison cells. The crew members who pulled off the heist are all dead now. Some were murdered, some died in prison. Henry Hill, the last survivor, died in 2012. Having spent more than 30 years in witness protection, never able to return to his old life, never able to benefit from the robbery he had been part of. And Jimmy Burke, he's remembered, but not in the way he might have wanted. He's remembered as a cautionary tale, as a character in a movie, as the man whose paranoia destroyed the perfect crime. His genius is acknowledged, but so is his brutality, his ruthlessness, his willingness to murder even his closest associates to protect himself. What did you think of Jimmy Burke's story? Do you think he could have gotten away with it if he hadn't killed his crew? The question haunts criminologists and true crime enthusiasts to this day. The technical answer is probably yes. If the crew had maintained discipline, if no one had talked, if Jimmy hadn't panicked and started eliminating witnesses, the Lufthansa heist might have remained unsolved. But that answer ignores the reality of human nature. Criminals are criminals precisely because they lack the discipline and judgment to succeed in legitimate pursuits. Giving desperate, greedy men millions of dollars and expecting them not to draw attention to themselves is unrealistic. Someone was always going to make a mistake. Someone was always going to talk. The perfect crime was always going to be undermined by imperfect people. And Jimmy Burke, for all his intelligence, was fundamentally unable to trust anyone. The paranoia that kept him alert and cautious for decades became a pathology that consumed him and everyone around him. He couldn't accept that the best way to keep a secret was not to kill everyone who knew it, but to give them a reason to keep it. If you made it this far through this story, through the full arc from abandoned infant to criminal mastermind to dying prisoner, thank you for taking this journey. The story of Jimmy Burke is American tragedy, a tale of wasted potential and misused genius, of loyalty betrayed and trust destroyed, of a perfect crime ruined by imperfect humanity. The Lufthansa heist happened more than 46 years ago, but it continues to fascinate us. It appears in documentaries and books and articles. New generations discover it through Goodfellas and wonder about the truth behind the fiction. The FBI file remains technically open, though no one seriously expects any new developments. Jimmy the Gent Burke is gone, buried in an unmarked grave on Long Island. Most of the people who knew him in life are gone too, dead or scattered or silent, but the legend remains. The story of the brilliant criminal whose greatest success became his ultimate failure, who pulled off the perfect crime and then destroyed himself trying to keep it secret. Sleep well, or try to, after hearing this story. And remember, some crimes may seem perfect in execution, but they all carry the seeds of their own destruction. Jimmy Burke learned that lesson too late, and it cost him everything. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of American crime's most legendary figures, subscribe for more stories from the underworld. Hit that like button Share this with anyone fascinated by true crime. Drop a love in the comments if you made it all the way through. Next time, we'll explore another legendary figure from organized crime history. Another story of ambition and betrayal, success and failure. Until then, remember the tale of Jimmy the Gent Burke, the man who had everything and lost it all, who pulled off the biggest heist in history and died with nothing, who proved that in the end, crime doesn't pay, it only collects.